Sure. Yeah, so Steve, that's a great point. This whole notion of fear of God, which you're absolutely right, there's a lot of people out there who are afraid of God. They talk about the fear of God. They talk about the fear of God as, like you were just saying, almost controlling their behavior or dictating what they should do and they shouldn't do, kind of a thing. And you'd mentioned this, and you look around in the world and we see this cruelty, we see this behavior that people don't treat each other well, and sometimes treat each other really badly. You know, and what's that about? And how does that fit in with all this? And, you know, first of all, I remember a story that Jesus told us many times. And as I said earlier, he viewed Jehovah as his fatherly figure, shall we say. Not his literal father, but his fatherly figure. And they had obviously a very close relationship. And he said to us, he told us this many times, he said, Jehovah is so much love and so much generosity in his personality, let's say, we'll call it. Imagine the most loving, generous father you could imagine, human father, and multiply that 70 times 7 times. And he said, then you're starting to approach the level of love and generosity that Jehovah has. And that has always resonated in my mind because that's what I remember Jesus saying to us many, many times. Well, fearing somebody like that, at its outset, kind of doesn't make sense, really. I think this whole notion of fear of God was created by other people. I know it wasn't created by Jesus. And it's certainly not something that's promoted by Jehovah himself. That notion of fear in general, what does fear, whether it's fear of God or fear of anything, do? It contracts us. And if somebody is pushing fear on us to make us fearful, either of them or whatever, what are they trying to do? Control us, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious. It's one of the best controlling mechanisms out there, to use fear. But how do you transcend that? You know, because another angle on this whole use of fear in that way is that sometimes people use that to be cruel with other people. And what's cruelty? Cruelty, I would define as, you know, a person is cruel when they get happiness out of inflicting pain on somebody else. Whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, whatever. They're inflicting unhappiness, pain on other people, and they derive happiness from that. That's cruel behavior. Why do they do that? They do that because they're not feeling good about themselves. They feel small. They feel powerless. There's some level of powerlessness going on inside of that cruel person, essentially. And what do they do to try to make themselves more happy? Ironically, interestingly enough, the pursuit of happiness, which is the pursuit that we all have, the cruel person has too. But how does the cruel person who's feeling powerless within themselves, that cruel person who has a low sense of self-esteem, a low sense of self-confidence within him or herself, how do they make themselves feel more happy? Well, they make themselves feel more happy by making other people around them feel worse. That controlling of them, that making them feel smaller than they feel small, that making them feel more miserable than they feel miserable. That type of behavior that type of cruel behavior actually comes from the same pursuit of happiness, although in a twisted way. Definitely in a twisted way. So that's the kind of, I think, logic behind it. So it kind of makes sense. But what do you do? What can you do to help change that cruel person's behavior? Well, essentially, it's just, like I talked about earlier, it's the strengthening them from within. What's that? That's that ancient Greek notion of virtue. Again, not the rules-oriented, do this, don't do that, to be afraid of God kind of rules-oriented notion of virtue, but the ancient Greek sense, strengthening oneself from inside and then coming out feeling stronger because one's more self-confident inside. Well, that makes the person feel less and less powerless, more and more powerful within themselves. It increases his or her self-esteem. That makes them less and less likely to be cruel. You know, that's how to change that kind of behavior. But the fear of God, as you were at the outset of your question, you were talking about the fear of God. I mean, what are people really fearing, essentially? What's underlying that fear? It's fear of punishment, isn't it, really? I mean, that's what they're really afraid of. And what are they afraid of? Punishment of? Heaven or hell. You know, and it doesn't really matter what religion you're talking about. Different religions may call it something different, but there's this notion of good and bad. This is good place, bad place. Again, they may label it differently, but if we're talking about Christianity, they talk about heaven and hell. Well, first of all, from a historical standpoint, Jesus never talked about hell. There is nothing in the Bible, in fact, that talks about hell. The book of Revelations talks about this notion of hell. But the book of Revelations, if you go back and look historically at it, that was one of the last books that was incorporated into the Bible around 300 AD